Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Historian of Truth channel. I am the Historian of Truth, and I would like to say class is now in session. Today, my video thesis is going to be on a character who is somewhat forgotten by a lot of people in society, but had such great influence on conservative politics after 1964. He was instrumental in starting the Reagan Revolution. Many of the great conservative leaders over the last 50, 60 years have cited him as their biggest influence. And in actuality, he was the loser of the election. And that person is Mr. Barry Goldwater, the senator from Arizona. Most people remember his predecessor. After he retired from the Senate in Arizona, he was replaced by Senator John McCain, who proceeded to be senator from Arizona for many decades and actually ran for president in 2008 against Barack Obama. And so Barry Goldwater, though, at the time, was considered a radical by a lot of people because he was a libertarian. He believed that the government should be as minimal as possible and in people's lives the least amount. Many conservatives today would disagree with Barry Goldwater on certain issues. Barry Goldwater was such a libertarian that he supported abortion rights. And he also supported gay marriage, which for most of conservatives today, especially religious conservatives, would be taboo and would anger many of them. But he was such a libertarian, a Jeffersonian in many ways, that he believed the government should be as limited as possible and that local rule and state rule should be the norm. Now, one of the things that happened that Barry Goldwater did, and he's most known for, and we're going to discuss it in this, is the fact that he was opposed when he ran for president in 1964. He was opposed to the famous Civil Rights Act of 1964. That was one of the biggest pieces of legislation. It basically outlawed segregation and racial discrimination after the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. And he opposed it because of two sections in there, neither one of them having to do with race at all, which we will discuss later. But he was vilified by the Democratic Party. He ran for president and actually was the Republican nominee in 1964. And he was running against Lyndon Johnson, who signed the Civil Rights Act. And he was one of very few Republicans to actually oppose the Civil Rights Act. There was very few of them that did. As a matter of fact, the author of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was Everett Dirksen, a Republican from the state of Illinois, the home state of Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican president in the nation's history. And Barry Goldwater opposed it, but not for racial reasons. But his opponents vilified him for doing so. They went after him. So many of people in the Democratic Party and the Democratic establishment opposed Barry Goldwater and made sure it was up front that everybody knew that he had opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, going as far as calling him a racist and things of that nature, which that still exists today with many in the Democratic Party. As they say, Barry Goldwater started it, and they have been using that tactic ever since. They were, people like the NAACP spoke out against him, and they spoke out against him, and so did people like Martin Luther King Jr., Roy Wilkins. He was the spokesman for the NAACP. He spoke out against him, and and many other, Martin Luther King, the Southern Christian leadership, as I said, they opposed him, and spoke about, saying that he was, basically, uh, that he was racist. I mean, for example, King, or Martin Luther King Jr.'s wife, Coretta Scott King, says that she felt that Goldwater represented forces that wished to suppress the black people of America. That his program, reactionary in general, gave voice to what specifically came to be called white backlash. Um, and so that's what she opposed. The James Farmer of the Congress of Racial Equality, he opposed him. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee opposed him as well. These Stokely Carmichael opposed him, who later became a future Black Panther. The Urban League accused him of being a racist. Andrew Young did as well. So you can see Jackie Robinson even opposed him. And Jackie Robinson has spent most of his life as a Republican, and he opposed him. A. Philip Randolph. These are just many names of all these Democrats. Hubert Humphrey, who ran with Lyndon Johnson, accused him of being a racist. Eugene McCarthy did. All of these people, we can name them all the way down. These Democrats, and all of them claimed that um, he was a racist, and you can see that over and over again. But in actuality, what I'm going to argue in this video essay is that Barry Goldwater actually, if you look at every presidential candidate that has ever existed, and we're not going to go over every presidential candidate, but if you look at the presidential candidates throughout history, Barry Goldwater is the most pro-civil rights candidate to ever run for president. And most people don't realize that. So, before we get into that, the question becomes, who is Barry Goldwater? Barry Goldwater was born on January 1st, 1909 in Phoenix, Arizona. He was actually Jewish, as you can tell. His family owned a clothing store. He attended Staunton Military Academy in Virginia, where he graduated in 1928. After he graduated high school, he attended the University of Arizona. Um, but he eventually had to leave the University of Arizona when his father died. So he took over for the family stores that they ran, their Goldwater stores. In World War II, Goldwater fought in the Air Force. Um, and after he came back, he continued to stay on with his family clothing store. He followed that up with a brief stint on the Phoenix City Council. And in 1952, he ran for the Senate against Democrat Ernest McFarland of Arizona. And so eventually, though, he would win. He was when he won, he was a staunch anti-communist. He was a supporter of Joseph McCarthy, the Wisconsin Center, and the McCarthyism, where they were investigating all of these accusations of communism within certain groups in Hollywood and all this. He was a staunch defender of Joseph McCarthy, and he vehemently opposed um, communism because he felt like it was the antithesis to the American way of life, of freedom, and the freedom to um, speak your mind, and the freedom to do what you please to do in your life and to be free. That was that kind of Western Jeffersonianism coming out in him. This kind of freedom, Second Amendment rights, these sorts of things. He was a staunch supporter of McCarthy in there, um, and so he also was very, very opposed to the New Deal. He was opposed to all the government programs within the New Deal, and he kind of fought against all of that. Um, he was a big supporter of the Young Americans for Freedom, um, and in 1960, he wrote a book that became pinnacle for many in the conservative movement. As you can see on that side, it's called The Conscience of a Conservative. He wrote this with L. Brent Bozell, and what it did was it outlined his conservative principles and his arguments. And it's a very short book, it's not very big, but it was so influential on so many people. If you look back on all of these people, people like Dan Quayle and who was the Vice President of the United States, and so many others, Ronald Reagan, that became the conservatives of the 80s and the 90s. Bill Kristol and all these people, the conscience of a conservative when they were in their early college years or formative years, young kids or in their college years, that book was very influential on them, and it sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and those people became influenced and really became what they called Goldwaterites. Even one of the interesting things was Hillary Clinton. Actually, her family was a supporter of Barry Goldwater. She campaigned for him in 1964, which we're going to talk about. Uh, but many of them, the the many of them that um, read that book, it became it became something of something that that they looked to answer their questions and really believe what they believed in. Um, and so as time went on, um, Barry Goldwater would run for the Republican nomination in 1964 against Lyndon Johnson. Okay, and like I said, he used to. He very famously said when he was speaking, the Democrats tried to paint him as a radical racist person who was trying to appeal to Southerners. But Goldwater was just running a campaign that was no different than his beliefs. Lyndon Johnson was running, he was trying to win Southern votes. Lyndon Johnson had a history of opposing integration and civil rights. He was not a civil rights champion. But they painted Barry Goldwater in this light as basically they were trying to put all of their fallacies, because if you know anything about it, the Ku Klux Klan was founded by the Democratic Party, by Southern Democrats. And it was an arm of the Democratic Party, especially the Democratic Convention of 1924. They made up half the delegation. The Democratic Party was always the Klan, but they tried to paint Goldwater as if he was the Klan. He wasn't even from the South, and he was Jewish. The Klan opposed Jewish people. The Nazi Party didn't like him either. The white supremacist parties didn't like Barry Goldwater because of his Jewishness. And so they tried to paint him as a racist. And Lyndon Johnson had his very famous Daisy Girl commercial where the girl's counting down, and she's counting. She's pulling off the pedals. She's like 10, 9, and then she like stops, and then it goes towards her eye, and there's a countdown. You can clearly hear Lyndon Johnson's voice, and it's like 1, 0, and it's like an atomic bomb saying that basically if you support Barry Goldwater, he's going to lead us to a a a nuclear standoff, nuclear war against the communists because of his anti-communist stance. And like I said, all of his opponents, all of the liberal opponents of him, started pointing to him as if he's a racist. And he famously said at the Republican convention that um, he had a very famous quote. Let me make sure I get this right. It's Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the defense of justice is no virtue. And many people claimed, everyone, his slogan was, "In your heart, you know he's right." And Lyndon Johnson kind of quipped back in a funny slogan. It says, "No, in your guts, you know he's nuts," and that's kind of funny. But Goldwater ended up not winning. He lost in a landslide, but his legacy lived on with the disciples that he got from this movement from there that eventually captured the Republican Party and led to the presidency of Ronald Reagan and but like Donald Trump and the Republicans winning the House. People like Newt Gingrich and all these people that were instrumental in the Republican Party in the 80s and 90s, and the Congress and the senators, Lindsey Graham, these sorts of people, they were all Goldwater people, and they looked to him as that. And John McCain famously said once Barry Goldwater retired in 1986 from the Senate. Um, he told him, he said, "I hope," when John McCain said, he goes, "I hope I could live up to the values and the legacy of Barry Goldwater." And so Barry Goldwater, like I said, is forgotten a lot, but he ended up dying in 1998. But I'm going to argue in this video essay, that Barry Goldwater was actually the most pro-civil rights candidate we've ever had in U.S. history. And when you see the evidence, I think you'll have to agree with that. No other president in the history has done more, but our presidential candidate has done more for civil rights before he ran for president than Barry Goldwater did. Okay? And so that's what I'm going to talk about in here. Okay? And that he was the most pro-civil rights candidate that this country has ever seen. More pro-civil rights than people like they claim: Barack Obama, Lyndon Johnson, Jimmy Carter, um, um, and all these things. But it's let me just give you some examples of this. Okay. Since his beginning as a politician, Goldwater fought for African American equality. "I love my fellow man, be he white or black or yellow," he wrote in 1939, "and I am vitally interested in his well-being, for that well-being is my well-being." He concluded by saying, "I cannot pass on to my son or sons any more valuable advice than to treat those whom you associate as those people should be treated by a man who is good to all." Ex- ex- Expressing his commitment to seeing all races given equal treatment under the law, Goldwater continued to aid blacks in breaking the political and social barriers of segregation and racism. As president of his family's business, the Arizonan desegregated all of his family stores, allowing African American employees to work alongside whites. He was instrumental in the desegregation of the Arizona National Guard and the airport restaurant when he was a member of the Phoenix City Council. After winning the Senate seat from McFarland in 1952, he forced the integration of the Senate cafeteria over many objections, so that his African American assistant, Catherine Maxwell, could eat there with him. He was the first to have an African American eat with him in that cafeteria. She was the first African American allowed to eat in that when it was desegregated, because Barry Goldwater pushed for it to be desegregated. He was a longtime member of the NAACP, and at its 1955 convention, Goldwater was an honored speaker, and he touted the racial progress of the Eisenhower administration and the Republican Party as a whole. While he was in the Senate, Goldwater voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which was the first major civil rights legislation since 1875, and 1960 as well. And he also voted for the constitutional amendment to end the poll tax, which had been utilized for years by racists in the South in order to disenfranchise poor blacks. In his book, The Conscience of a Conservative, the Arizona senator commented about integrating public schools. He said, "I am in complete agreement with the objectives of the Supreme Court. It is both wise and just for black children to attend the same schools as whites, and that to deny them this opportunity carries with it strong implications of inferiority." He held similar views when it came to the segregation of transportation depots. "No city or state," he said in 1963, "has the right to segregate bus terminals, airline terminals, or railroad stations that are in interstate commerce." During his presidential campaign, he showed a supporter named Stuart Alsop of the Saturday Evening Post a picture of whites beating an African American male at a restaurant in Mississippi. Goldwater said, "White or black, it makes no difference. Decent people won't take that." Once again, Goldwater expressed his sympathy for blacks who receive racist and inferior treatment throughout the nation. Um, After he voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the news media consistently asked him the legitimate question about how or if he would enforce the law if he were to occupy the White House. "Senator Goldwater will do whatever was necessary to enforce it," explained his campaign manager, Dennis Kinchell. "And if it took a mammoth police force, that is what he would get." Okay. Later in his life, Goldwater noted, "Never in my life had I ever advocated, suggested, or implied any form of racism." So as you can see, um, as you can see, there were there were many times where he condemned the segregation and the ill treatment of African Americans in the United States. He condemned it many, many times, even before he was promoting civil rights, even before the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 and before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He condemned the Klan. He said during his campaign, "We don't want the backing of the Ku Klux Klan. It has never supported Republicans. It's been a Democratic organization all throughout its history." As he was part Jewish, they were against him. Okay? He said, "We are certainly not accepting the support or endorsement of the organizations like the KKK." Okay? And so many of these, uh, as you can see, um, they really went after him because of his attempts to win people in the South. He was trying to win people throughout the country, but he wanted to, because the Republicans never really made inroads in the South. The South had always been solidly Democrat. Occasionally, one or two states might vote Republican, but Goldwater wanted to be a Republican candidate who could win the South. Many of them claimed that he was appealing to the racist, but that's not true. Because in a speech before the Republican Men's Club of Oklahoma, he wanted to win what he called the New Southerner. "I believe," he told the crowd in 1963, "the most stupid, irresponsible suggestion I have ever heard put forward is the argument that the Republican Party should soft pedal its efforts in the South because a determined effort in the area might give the party a racist tinge and cost our candidates votes in the metropolitan areas of the North." Goldwater uh, believed that the Republicans that were in the South that they were not actually prejudiced. When the party picked up seats in Congress the previous year, he said not one of the Southern Republican members of the House or Senate has ever campaigned on racial issues, whereas almost without exception their Democratic opponents have. Okay, so he said that the South was moderating its view and moving past the racism and the segregation, that there was a new Republican who was as he said, an economic conservatism stemming from the growth in business, the increase in per capita income, and the rising confidence of the South in its ability to expand industrially and commercially. He said the Republican Party's record on civil rights is clear and cannot be successfully challenged. We have not had to ignore the law to force integration, nor have we deliberately evaded the law in an effort to win votes in northern cities. Okay? So as you can see, Barry Goldwater uh, is not has not been a racist at all. He never was a racist. He didn't run on racial issues. When the Civil Rights Act was passed, he opposed the act for two reasons. It was the discrimination within a restaurant and discrimination within housing. And it had nothing to do with race on his part. He argued because the act said that like for example, a landlord cannot make any sort of discrimination upon anybody who applies to their to their to live in their apartments, as long as that person is able to pay. Barry Goldwater argued, well, what if the person is a drug dealer or a prostitute? He never said anything about racists, the race. He never did. It was always about this person may be a prostitute, or maybe a drug dealer, or somebody who is got other problems. And so you should not force somebody to take somebody on as a client and in an apartment complex who may be sketchy. They have to have be able to discriminate a little bit on those types of people. And the same thing came with businesses. He talked about, what if a drug dealer or a prostitute comes into a restaurant and the restaurant owner doesn't want to serve them? He never said about race. It was never about that. He felt that that was unconstitutional. That was going past what um, what was in the scope of the federal government. And that's what he said with a lot of things, was that you have to obey the Constitution. He very much like Rand Paul. He had no problem if they wanted to, for example, get rid of discrimination based upon if they wanted to get rid of discrimination based upon those things, like whether someone's a prostitute or drug dealer, he's pass a constitutional amendment. That was his view. You should just pass a constitutional amendment. And since there was no constitutional amendment, it's based upon the states. And that's the way that he looked at it. He was a strict constructionist when it came to the Constitution. And so Barry Goldwater, that's why he voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But there was a lot of debate with that. He was still debating whether he was going to vote against it up until the day before. The vote came, and Everett Dirksen even talked to him about it. But he voted against it. But the voting against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the only civil rights bill that he ever voted against. It was the only one. He had spent his entire career fighting for the civil rights of African Americans and other minorities in the United States. He opposed segregation wherever you can see it. And so I am arguing in this thing that in this video essay that Barry Goldwater was the most pro-civil rights presidential candidate in U.S. history. And I recommend that none of you, if you feel the same way, allow revisionist historians to say otherwise. The evidence is very, very clear that Barry Goldwater was the most pro-civil rights presidential candidate in U.S. history. And it's not even close. It's not even close. Many of these other ones they claim were so pro-civil rights, Lyndon Johnson spent most of his career fighting against civil rights before he became president. People like Jimmy Carter, they claim, was so pro-civil rights. Jimmy Carter was a segregationist in his younger years. Bill Clinton, they claim, was so pro-civil rights. Bill Clinton, his mentor was J. William Fulbright. He was an intern under J. William Fulbright in Arkansas. J. William Fulbright voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and was a staunch segregationist. Al Gore, they claimed he was pro-civil rights. Al Gore Sr.'s dad, Al Gore Sr., voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and was pro-segregation. So all of these candidates, they have not fought for civil rights as Barry Goldwater did. And I will conclude by saying once again, Barry Goldwater is the most pro-civil rights candidate in U.S. history. What do you think? Do you think I'm wrong? You can comment below. I thank you all again for hearing and listening in. This is the Historian of Truth. And I say, class is dismissed.